Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping Canadian national security and defense. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. This week, both the Conservative and Liberal parties released their respective party platforms, each containing sections on their plans and proposed investments for Canada's defense and security. Today, we invite Vincent Rigby back on the program to unpack some of the details of both platforms, what they get right, what's missing, and the impact of President Trump on this election cycle, as well as the bilateral relationship. Vincent Rigby is a CDAI board member, former national security and intelligence advisor to the Prime Minister, and currently the Slater Family Professor of Practice at McGill's Max Bell School. This is the Expert Series. So as you'll know, and as our audience will know, the Liberals and Conservatives released their respective party platforms this week, Canada Strong and Canada First. Both platforms contain relatively lengthy sections on Canada's defense and security spending. So hopefully you've had a chance to take a look. I'm wondering if you can provide us with what your key takeaways were from an initial glance on the respective platforms, and maybe let us know what maybe stood out to you most about each.
Sure. Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is there's nothing really of great surprise. Nothing jumped out at me like, wow, that's a shocker. I didn't expect that. That came out of left field. That came out of right field. I think a lot of what you see in the two platforms, they'd already hinted at before. They'd made previous announcements. A number of the specific points in the Liberal platform are right out of the last defense update. Are North strong and free, so they're building on that. And on the Conservative side, I think that Mr. Poilievre had already made a number of the announcements, especially the focus on the Arctic and so on and so forth. So that would be my first comment, that there's no great surprises. A lot of similarities between the two, to be perfectly honest with you. No huge differences. I'd say the differences are more at the margins and in some of the nuances. So they both have the commitment to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2030. I can come back to that in a second in terms of how relevant that is. There is a great focus on the Arctic, which I think is a good thing. There is a lot on specific capabilities, and again, they're broadly similar, whether it's AWACS or subs or icebreakers or artillery or whatever the case may be. I think that there's not a huge divergence there in terms of what they want to do, and even in the spending. They're broadly similar. I think the Liberals came in at 18 billion over 4 years, and the Conservatives come in at 17 over 4 years. So there's not a lot of space there. Conservative platform is probably a little bit more detailed, especially on the defense side. Probably a little bit, even though they're spending slightly less. There's a few more things that are in. There's a little bit more specificity, so you can take some of that and parse it a little bit more easily than you can with the Liberal platform. I found the Liberal platform perhaps a little bit more vague in terms of what they want to do, but then that's normal for these kinds of platforms, right? The devil's in the details. There's some throwaway lines in there, but they're going to enhance this or increase that, or they're going to look at doing more of this, but they don't really provide the details. And we'll have to see what happens if once one of them forms government, they'll come out with those details, hopefully, and hopefully they will implement all of this. And of course, that's the other great mystery: how much of this will actually be carried out at the end of the day. So those are my key takeaways. I mean, those are kind of factual impressions. I'd say that they're a little underwhelming, to be honest. We've been talking a lot on this podcast, and commentators have been talking more broadly, and governments, about how unstable and unpredictable and dangerous the world is right now. And we've seen these patterns over the last 5 or 10 years. And then everything's been compounded, of course, by what's been happening south of the border and all the threats from Trump and the Republican administration. And so I was perhaps expecting a little bit more of a vision here in terms of how Canada's defense, how Canada's national security is going to operate in this new world. I mean, there are references to the U.S., especially in the Liberal platform, but not a lot on exactly how we're going to deal with the U.S., both in terms of competition, but also cooperation, especially all the focus on the Arctic. We can cooperate with the U.S. in the Arctic as well, and there's not a lot there. The connections to national security more broadly aren't really there. There's more specifics in the Conservative platforms about what they'll do on the national security front, sort of more on the domestic side. But it's on the Liberal side where they say, there's actually going to still be a national security review. and they want to conduct that. There's going to be a foreign policy review as well, which I think is a good thing. But connecting that to defense, the vision about how this is all going to play out at home in North America, internationally, is not really there. So you kind of leave the two. I left the two after reading them, a little, as I say, underwhelmed, and looking for that great vision of where we want to go in terms of defense, national security writ large, our foreign policy in this really changed world. So, not surprising. This is the way it is in Canadian elections. This stuff is always underplayed. I naively thought that maybe this election would be a little bit different, but it's pretty much gone according to what you'd expect.
To what extent do the respective platforms convey a solid understanding of the current and emerging geopolitical risks to Canada and some of the other emerging threats and challenges to Canada within the platform? So I'm thinking threats posed by Russia, the Arctic, etc. Do they both? To what level of understanding do they seem to portray?
Well, I think that the focus on the Arctic is a good thing. It's not surprising, as I said, we've already seen this in the previous Liberal government under Trudeau, with the defense update, that there'd be a greater focus on the Arctic, and this is in response to Russian Chinese activities in the northern region, and so that was there. And Polyev had mentioned doing all kinds of different things in the Arctic, including the icebreakers and um, permanent Canadian Forces bases and so on and so forth. I think that's a reflection of their understanding that there's a greater threat in the Arctic, and that we need to take care of our sovereignty. We need to protect our territory. So I think that's good in that way. I mean, there's not a lot in the platform itself on the threat environment, and again, you wouldn't expect that. It's not a defense document per se. It's broadly about their platform, so they're not going to give you a 1 or 2 or 3 page threat assessment. But beyond the Arctic, um, I don't really get a sense of them saying, "Well, this is the threat out there, so we've got to do this or we got to do that." All the stuff that we've seen over the last number of years at home with respect to Chinese foreign interference and hostile state activity, I think there's a little bit more in the conservative platform about that, quite frankly, than on the liberal platform. There's very little with respect to hard national security capabilities in the liberal platform, and you find that kind of surprising given everything that we've gone through with the Hogue Commission and the debacle over Chinese meddling in Canadian affairs and Canadian elections and so on and so forth. There's a little bit there. Again, they'll conduct a national security review, but I don't see a lot about CISA's capabilities or CSC, for example, in the Liberal platform. A passing reference to the RCMP, building on what the Trudeau government has said in their white paper, that they need to look at the RCMP. Um, so I would have hoped to have seen a little bit more on that in terms of hostile state activity. What we're going to do internationally, again, there's no real tie into foreign policy in either platform. There's probably more on the Liberal side with respect that they will conduct a foreign policy review. There's a lot in the Liberal platform about sort of soft power, international assistance in particular, and that's quite a contrast between the two platforms, of course, because Poilievre's talking about cutting the aid budget, and the Liberals are saying, no, we're going to continue with the aid budget, and especially on international humanitarian assistance, girls and women's, LGBTQ, those sorts of things. We'll continue to do them. But the tie into what the Canadian forces, the Canadian Armed Forces, might have to do internationally, there's not a lot. On the conservative side, there's talk about Ukraine and continue to support Ukraine, but if there's conflict overseas, the capabilities the Canadian Armed Forces will need, there's not a lot, to be honest with you. So again, it's very Arctic domestic focus, but what's going on in the broader world? I mean, if a major regional war breaks out in Europe or Indo-Pacific, you don't get a sense from either of these platforms about what the Canadian Armed Forces are going to have from these governments to go and do their jobs.
You mentioned it earlier, but would you be able to talk a little bit about what each respective platform says in terms of hitting our NATO goals and by when and how much?
I think this is what stands out for me perhaps more than anything else. So we finally have both parties in black and white in writing committing to 2% by 2030. So that's nice to see. And this is long overdue. As we all know, the Liberal government hooed and hawed about how this was an arbitrary figure. And at one point, we even heard that the Prime Minister Trudeau, had said that we never reached that 2% figure. So they've said it, but they haven't actually been so bold, I don't think, in terms of putting it down on paper that they're going to reach that 2% figure now. So that's a good thing. And the Conservatives are the same both by 2030. The problem is that we're coming very late to the party. Virtually the last NATO member to make that kind of formal commitment and to try and reach it. But we're not only coming late to the party, but and not to push the metaphor too far, but the party's probably moved on. We're going to the wrong party now. So by the time 2030 rolls around, the target's probably not going to be 2%. It's probably going to be 2.5 or 3% or 3.5%. I mean, this isn't an American talking point alone anymore. This is the NATO Secretary General saying it, and other NATO allies, we need to move beyond 2%. And for years, we've been saying it was a floor and not a ceiling. Well, I think very, very soon that we're going to see that manifest itself into reality, that there is a new ceiling, and it is likely to be a much higher than 2% figure. So this is where I come back to relevance. Nice to see, but I would have hoped, perhaps naively, that one of the parties would say, yeah, we're going to reach 2% by X year. If it's 2030, still 5 years away, but better than nothing. But beyond 2030, we're gonna look to get to 2.5 or 3%, because that's where the trend is headed. That's where I expect it's going to be very, 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 very soon. So again, late to the party, and the party's moved on, and there'll be further pressure on the government very, very soon to up that figure even more. So a little disappointing, but not completely surprising.
You mentioned that you had expected to see more, just given the current security climate we're in right now, especially vis-a-vis the United States. So, are you convinced that both parties still legitimately see the Trump administration as perhaps a significant challenge to deal with, or do you think maybe what we've seen maybe perhaps has been rhetoric, or is it possible that the whole Trump saga has been kind of used a bit more politically, since both platforms are not as defense heavy as we may have anticipated? I guess what I'm saying is, I mean, obviously Trump poses a lot of challenges regardless, but it seems like there's just been, as you kind of alluded to, a lot of talk and a lot of expectations about Canada perhaps using the moment to release a more robust defense platform. And what we've seen, as you've kind of conveyed, is that it's sort of same old, same old. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this.
I think that's broadly accurate. It is a little bit. I'm not going to say same old, because there's lots of new stuff in there. There's no doubt about it. A lot of it is building on what they've already announced, whether it's the Liberal defense update or Conservative proclamations recently. So to give them credit in that regard, there are a few new twists, not a lot. But I mean, the overall election campaigns have been framed very differently, right? And so you see that now manifested in the written platforms, where Trump is much more front and center in the Liberal platform. References to the U.S. writ large, references to trade war, references to U.S. aggressiveness or aggression. Those are much more numerous in the Liberal platform as opposed to the Conservative platform. You know, the Conservatives have been saying this is about Trump, but it's also just about change. It's about doing things differently than the Liberals, whereas the Liberals are much more focused on Trump as a threat. But even though the rhetoric or the approach might be a little bit different, when you come right down to it on the defense side, they're not fundamentally different. And I think that's a missed opportunity. Now, you're not building up the Canadian military to defend against a U.S. attack. I don't think anybody's yet in that world where we have to start thinking about a U.S. invasion. But it would have been interesting to see a little bit more talk in the defense security realm about the U.S. threat and the opportunities for cooperation where we could still work with them, because I remain convinced that no matter what happens, we still share a continent with the U.S. And when it comes to defense, we are connected at the hip, whether we like it or not. So where those opportunities for cooperation. I've already cited the Arctic as a perfect example of where we could possibly do more with the U.S. there, notwithstanding a lot of their very aggressive rhetoric about the region lately with Greenland, et cetera. But can we work with them? And then laying out where we're going to have to be more competitive. And so there are lines in there about how we're going to have to diversify our defense procurement. We'll have to look to the Europeans more, and so on and so forth. We'll have to buy more Canadian, but it's all very high level stuff, right? And there's not a lot in terms of how we're going to respond to the U.S. threat by doing things a little bit differently on the defense front. So the challenges, the opportunities, you don't see much of that in either of the platforms in my view. So the U.S. is there more in the liberal platform as they're threatening us. The conservatives kind of brush it over. But in neither platform do you see a way ahead in terms of on the defense and security side, how do we deal with the U.S., whether it's in North America or abroad, internationally. That's, I think, underplayed.
Seems as though many people I've spoken to and had on the program believe that believe exactly what you said, that the U.S.-Canada relationship will always be necessary to a large degree because of our shared continent history. And Canada, 77% of its trade, I believe, is with the United States. And I've talked to some who think over time that will still remain the case. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the potentiality for Canada to join something like Europe's rearmament initiative. On top of that, a few weeks ago, we were also talking about, of course, the F-35 acquisition. So maybe you could touch on possibility for Canada to join something like that. And also, what is the feasibility of Canada divesting away from the United States and looking to others to purchase defense equipment from? That was an issue earlier in the election. It seems to have gone a little quieter now, but curious to hear your thoughts here as well.
So it's a great question, and I'm actually teaching a course at the Max Bell School of Public Policy right now, where I work, on Canada-U.S. relations. And so one of the themes of the course, looking at the history of the Canada-U.S. relationship, including on the defense and security side, um, this is not a history of unambiguous success and high points and everything's tickety-boo. It's a relationship that's been um, there's a lot of cooperation, but there's been a lot of friction. There's been a lot of ups and downs. There have been a lot of trouble spots. I lived through them, some of them when I was in the Department of National Defense, including ballistic missile defense negotiations and not going to Iraq. And I remember at the time, a lot of us saying, "Oh my God, this is going to be the end of the Canada-U.S. defense relationship. The Americans will never talk to us again." We've been through Beaumark. We've been through, the list goes on and on and on of all the different pressure points going back, 150 years back to Confederation, even before Confederation. So it's not like we've never had friction before. Now, you can argue that Trump is of a different order of magnitude, and this is absolutely beyond the pale. It's an existential threat. Maybe, yep. I tend to be more in the camp of these are still relatively early days. We have to take Trump extremely, extremely seriously. We cannot take lightly any of his pronouncements, but we also have to be realistic. And I get a little bit nervous when I start hearing comments about how the relationship is effectively done, that we should cancel F-35 contracts, we should go to Europe and join the Rearm Europe plan and just move away completely from the United States. Basically, the old cliche, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. Um, are those all potential options? Yeah, absolutely. And we've got to look at them. And I'm sure in the Department of National Defense and Foreign Affairs and other places, they're dreaming up and exploring all kinds of different scenarios right now as to how it may play out. But I go back to what I said earlier and what you said. Geography is always going to connect us. And whether it's trade or whether it's defense and security, we cannot snap our fingers and suddenly decide that we're going to go to Europe, we're going to go to the Indo-Pacific region and screw the Americans. It's not going to happen. Short of Trump going to war with us, which I don't think is going to happen either. So we're going to have to find a middle path here. As you said, we're already seeing some of the rhetoric, the temperature lowered by Trump. I think he's got a short attention span. We'll see with the new prime minister whether he goes back to the silliness over the 51st state and Governor Carney or Governor Poilievre, if he happens to win, we'll see if that comes back. But I suspect that he's got bigger fish to fry now. He's looking at China. He's looking at all these other big issues. He's got internal problems. His popularity is starting to drop. He's got midterm elections. He's got a thousand things. So we should be exploring all these options. We absolutely should, including on the defense security side. But we've also got to play a long game here. And so we're doing some of these things in our own national interests. Diversification on trade and security. We should be doing this regardless. And we should look at options in certain scenarios where we would get out of the F-35 contract and other procurement pieces. But it's not a zero-sum game. It's not U.S. or Europe, U.S. or Indo-Pacific. We're always going to have a U.S. game, whether we like it or not. Can we diversify more of our trade? We've been trying for 50 years and not been very successful. Can we diversify some of our defense and security? We haven't been trying as hard on that side. Can we do a little bit more procurement elsewhere? Yeah, absolutely. Can we increase ties with the Nordics? We already are. Can we increase defense ties with Japan or Korea? We've been doing a little bit of that. So we should be doing all of that stuff, but I don't think we should be in a world right now of hitting the panic button. I'm not a big fan of canceling the F-35 right away. I'm not a big fan of going to Europe and never again doing any defense procurements with the U.S. It's not going to happen. 80% of our defense procurement is with the U.S. That's not going to change overnight. So I think that we've got to approach this carefully. And the one great thing about the Department of National Defense is they're great planners. They're great at scenario-based planning. They're looking at all the different options. I'm sure the government is telling them to look at all the different options, and a new government will. But I think we have to be very careful, very methodical, very strategic in how we move forward on this.
Well, Vincent, thanks for your time today. Maybe we can wrap up by addressing one more question. You've provided some great analysis of the respective platforms. I'm wondering, without putting you in a position where I'm making you too critical of either platform, maybe you could talk a little bit about some issues you would have liked to see better represented in the respective platforms.
As I said, I think I would have liked a little bit more on national security, more broadly. I was disappointed given everything we've gone through over the last number of years with foreign interference, with the Freedom Convoy, hostile state activities, domestic extremism, that there wasn't a little bit more on national security and domestic security. So there's, as I said earlier, barely a passing reference to CSIS or CSE. I think more in the conservative platform with respect to disinformation and foreign interference and a few other elements. But I think that's required. I'm glad to see that the Liberals have come out and recommitted to a national security review. That's going to be really important. But after everything we've gone through, I would have hoped to have seen a little bit more. I mean, are we going to start to think about some bold initiatives like a foreign intelligence agency, human intelligence agency, and some other things that have been talked a lot about? I've been talking about them. People like Thomas Juneau, Wesley Wark have thrown out a lot of ideas, and the government, has got a lot of recommendations from the Hogue Commission, and we don't really get a sense from either party what they're going to do with those Hogue Commission recommendations, because they're really, really, really critical. So it'll be interesting to see how they move forward. Canada's place in the world. So this has a direct link to the Canadian Armed Forces. Again, more on the Liberal side, I think, at least strategically, they've committed to a foreign policy review. Thank God. We need a foreign policy. We've not had one in 20 years. It's the 20th anniversary of our last foreign policy statement. But where do we want Canada to fit in the world? And in my view, when you're deploying the CAF overseas, it's got to be driven by our foreign policy. Where are our regional priorities? What do we want to do in the world? What do we want to stand for, both on security and on softer capabilities, and how aid ties into security? All those things I'd love to see more of. And so I'm glad the Liberals are committed to a foreign policy review. Let's make it public. Let's make it open. Let's not have it going months and months, if not years, to complete. Let's do it quick and let's do it fast, but let's do it very comprehensively and link it to security and defense and so on. So I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of that. Again, I'm not going to be naive and say, I wish there'd been more details. It's a platform, right? They're not going to get into all that, but whoever forms the government, it'll be interesting to see what kind of meat they put on the bones of this and whether they stick to it, because we also know from previous electoral platforms that a lot of this stuff just gets lost in the wash, right? Once the government comes in, they look at the books and go, we can't afford this, we can't afford that. One thing I am disappointed in, and that I would advise them against doing it is the Conservatives cutting the aid budget. I don't think that's wise, and that's following in the footsteps of the Trump administration and all the cuts to USAID. The Brits have done it as well. Those cuts that they're talking about are not gonna fund improvements in defense. They're gonna undercut our foreign policy, our values, our soft power capabilities. I think it's a mistake, and we should be very, very careful about cutting some really important programs on the aid side. So, if I were talking to the Conservative government, I would certainly be suggesting that they revisit that, but I don't know if that's going to happen. So those are some of the thoughts in terms of advice and moving forward.
Well, Vincent, thanks for coming on the program again. It's always a pleasure to have you. It's always great to chat with you about these issues. And thank you also for being very generous with your time today. I think our audience will find a lot of interest in this discussion. So thanks for providing your analysis, and the CDA Institute appreciates your thought leadership.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me on the show again. Really appreciate it.
That brings us to the end of the pod. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you to our guest once again, Mr. Vincent Rigby. We hope you'll be tuning in next time.